Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. But America's agriculture landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertising campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food to the store where you buy the final product and everything in between. This is Real Ag. As a country with a great wealth of resources and ingenuity, it has also been necessary to give guidance to the farmers and ranchers of the United States to make the most of the land, give the best opportunities to those producers, and help conserve the soil, water, and other resources that we have available to us. The government has often been that establishment to help give that guidance. We will look at government policy as we speak with farmers and other producers, as well as the Department of Agriculture in Kansas, on this episode of Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Ever since the Agricultural Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives was created in 1820, and then the Agricultural Committee of the U.S. Senate was created in 1825, the United States government has always had a hand in agriculture. Since then, many guidelines and regulations were created in hopes to assist farmers and ranchers. In 1862, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was established. President Abraham Lincoln called it the People's Department. In 1906 came the Food and Drug Act, which was a landmark in food safety.
You know, in this country, we pride ourselves on having the safest food system around. And without a few guidelines, I don't think we'd have that safe food system. You know, we need a little guideline. You can't have anybody producing produce or any other food item and not have some kind of guidance on what they need to be doing. And we had no idea what kind of food safety protocols we needed to follow. We learned that in a hurry. K-State has a really good food safety and produce people that we learned everything we needed to get food safety certifications. We are GAP certified. That means good agricultural practice. So every year we do have a federal inspector come in here, reviews our paperwork, and he witnesses how we harvest. So we're harvesting in a safe manner according to federal guidelines. So as far as any other federal regulations, no, that's about the only one we kind of follow is our food safety regulations.
We have lots of regulation in terms of herbicide application. I think that's probably a good thing. Some of it seems maybe onerous, but you know, I think we need to be realistic of what we're doing out here. People don't always like regulations, but the reasons regulations exist is because people also weren't choosing to probably make the best choices, which led to regulation.
In 1914, the USDA opened state and regional offices across the country. In 1916 came the Federal Farm Loan Act, which created cooperative land banks to provide loans to farmers. Legislation during the 1930s expanded this farm credit system, and today the FCS is a 50-state network of financial cooperatives. In 1929, the Great Depression began, as well as the Agricultural Marketing Act, which created the Federal Farm Board to subsidize agriculture cooperatives. In 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the subsequent New Deal laws created the forerunners of today's major farm subsidy programs. In 1935, the Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation began large-scale food welfare activities with the distribution of surplus farm products to schools. 1936 saw the Rural Electrification Act, which initiated extensive rural subsidies that continue in various forms to this day. That same year, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act linked farm programs with conservation. In 1937, the Agriculture Marketing Agreement Act established federal marketing orders for dairy, fruits, vegetables, and other products. In 1938, a new Agriculture Adjustment Act was established, creating federal crop insurance to provide subsidized insurance for adverse weather conditions, insects, and other farming hazards. 1949 saw a new Agriculture Adjustment Act, extending crop price support and subsidy policies, as well as adding subsidies for the dairy industry, which put farm programs into permanent law. Since then, farm legislation has included expiration dates, which prompts Congress to pass renewed congressional authorizations every 5 or so years.
We can go back, certainly students of history, and you'd really talk about the Farm Bill, which was a Depression-era program created coming out of the 30s and 40s, so that is permanent farm law for the true policy wonks out there.
Like in a Farm Bill, if it passes, then there's potentially as much as a year before the regulations and the guidelines are established, and then it takes a while for producers to gauge whether they're going to participate or make modifications to their program. And then there's kind of that worldwide effect as, how has it affected supplies? It caused a change or a shift in what's grown. Is there more corn per se now and less wheat and soybeans because of the farm program? And usually it's unintended consequence, but that's why there's a lot of vetting and a lot of careful analysis, and probably now why there's not a substantial change in policy now year to year, because I think there's a realization that changes may need to occur, but if you do something significant overnight, you could have some unintended consequences that could really disrupt the market situation.
In 1964, we saw the creation of the Food Stamp Act. 1980 saw biotechnologies become a viable technique for improving crop and livestock production. In 1985, Congress passes the Food Security Act. This law added new farm subsidy programs, including the Export Enhancement Program and the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP.
1985 Farm Bill did create the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. Before that, there was a different set-aside program where the government was really trying to make sure the supply and demand was met in a different way.
And Kansas was one of the states with the highest amount of participation. And that's simply a program that a landowner would enter into voluntarily, usually 10 years, and say, hey, for 10 years, I'm not going to produce any grain commodities. I'm going to seed this down to cover and receive an annual rental payment to do so.
Its initial intent was to preserve fragile lands from wind and water erosion. Great need for that in the 80s and coming forward. Was really targeted to those soil types and those locations where wind and water had an adverse impact on the soil landscape.
He was predominantly focused on highly erodible lands. So in western Kansas, think the Dust Bowls. A lot of land in southwest Kansas blew away. So we needed to make sure that sort of land was kind of the highest priority when it came into the CRP program. Other states, there are some areas in Kansas that water erosion may be a higher concern. So those types of lands were protected. If it was kind of flood bottom, river adjacent type ground, they often got bid into the system very quickly.
It was good for the landscape, reducing erosion and runoff of nutrients and so on. Good for the environment, in my opinion, through increased habitat.
When you idle 30 or 35 or 40 million acres of productive farmland, you also have the benefit of reducing the amount of grain that's in the marketplace. So you're going to have a positive impact on grain prices, and CRP has done that as well.
And so in Kansas, I think probably there was as many as 2.5 million acres, if not more, perhaps 2.5 to 3 million acres enrolled in the late 80s with that program. So the impact of that was it took quite a few acres out of production. It provided a substantial amount of money that came to landowners in Kansas that was certainty, came every year. It provided a substantial amount of new enhanced wildlife habitat, which it was designed to do. And that stirred some more recreation. It really reduced erosion, because a lot of the lands that were enrolled were lands that were somewhat fragile and lower producing lands that probably some would say shouldn't have been broken out in the first place. So it had a lot of positive impacts, and that program is still in place today. It's been changed periodically over the years in each farm bill, but it's still in place in 2021.
It's evolved a lot since then. From what we were required to do early on to what we're required to do today is significantly different in terms of the species mix that we are to seed in. Now it's a much more diverse mix. Before it was just cover. In Nebraska and Iowa, where we used to live, smooth brome was a pretty suitable candidate for a lot of those acres because it was quick to establish itself and it provided cover. It kept that soil stable. Smooth brome's an invasive species, and not only did it create a great cover in that CRP, but it did across the fence and across the road, and so now the mix is more diverse. There are other wildlife, endangered species type considerations that are given.
As we've evolved in farm policy since 1985, certainly wildlife management has been more intensively focused area, if that's an appropriate way to put it. But basically, if we have an endangered species, if we have a species that's not trending in the right direction, I know our partners at Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited and Quails, Quail Forever, they would all argue that, well, we want to protect our hunting industry here in Kansas, and oftentimes if you manage CRP appropriately, it's an absolute boon for a lot of wildlife management. And even more recently, as we've started getting into pollinators and learning more about the monarch butterfly and bees, etc., making sure that even in our CRP acres, which is, again, put out of production agriculture and put into some sort of grassland here in Kansas, other states have timber management plans, making sure that we have the forage and other species mixed into that specific acreage that are enticing and invite the pollinator species in.
These gave farmers new options to take what might be marginal farm ground that they had, were pressured to farm because that was the only way they could really get value, significant value out of it. Well, it gave them another option to supplement their income and take that farmland, again, that typically marginal farmland, out of production. We have new programs now with related to wetland easement development and wetland restoration, among many others that are designed to help farmers take either environmentally sensitive land or vulnerable land to erosion and things like that, and take it out of crop production and put it in something more stable that they can just still get some financial benefit from.
And there's really currently two different ways to do it. You can do whole farm or whole tract sign up. So if you have a quarter section, 160 acres, you can bid that 160 acres into the CRP program. Another one is the continuous CRP program. So let's say you have 160 acres, but there's a stream or maybe a playa lake or some sort of wetland, cuts off a corner or maybe in the middle of the field. You can go in and basically hand select 5 acres, 10 acres, 15 acres, whatever the contour of that resource you're trying to protect, and get that enrolled into CRP.
You hear farmers grumble more about that, about how do I make sure that I meet the requirements of the plan, but not feel like I'm getting overburdened by the process. There might need to be some balancing there, but certainly the current administration is talking about getting back toward that 40 million acre number in CRP, or maybe even expanding beyond that. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of comes together. I think it's had good environmental benefits. I think it's had good market benefits, but I think it also has the ability to create some sustainability and regenerative ag benefits. We just have to define what those might look like and make sure that they fit with a modern farming operation.
Now, there are also, and we're also, some losers in this program, because to take that many acres out of production, and particularly if you look in some of the counties where there was a lot of participation, it had a big impact on agribusinesses because they weren't handling and marketing those commodities or providing sales for the inputs. There was less need for a labor force locally if land was enrolled in this program. And so it had some detractors and some negative economic impact in some situations.
One interesting thing about the CRP contract is at the end of that term, that expiration, if you don't re-enroll it, it's yours to break back out and farm. Certainly a lot of CRP acres has done that since 1986 if it was put in the program then, but we also know of a tremendous amount of former CRP acres that the producer decided it was too hilly, the side slopes, the terracing, whatever didn't work. So rather than breaking it out and farming it, we'll just go ahead and maintain the grass species and the grass cover on that specific tract of ground, but we'll put up the fence and we'll actually convert it back to grazing land. So a lot of very beneficial opportunity has come out of that program since 1985.
Taking that many acres out of annual crop production and putting it into, in Kansas anyway, it was native grass mixture, and continuing such a program for this many years, I think was one of the most significant policy decisions that was made that I think was significant because it sustained itself through the years.
In 1990, the Food, Agricultural Conservation and Trade Act and Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act increased farmers' flexibility in planting under government programs. In 1993, the Revised General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and new North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, lowered trade barriers. 1996 saw Congress changing course in farm policy with the passage of the Federal Agricultural Improvement and Reform Act, also known as the Freedom to Farm Bill. This law was designed to allow farmers greater planting flexibility and better aligned producer decisions to help market supply and demand.
And that 1996 Freedom to Farm Bill, that really allowed the producer to control their own destiny. So before, if you had 100 acres, you had to plant 50. In Kansas, you had to plant 50 acres of wheat, let's say 40 acres of grain sorghum, and then 10 acres of corn or soybeans or some other commodity. Well, producers went to Senator Roberts and Secretary Glickman, or then Representative Roberts, I should say, then Senator Dole, and then Secretary Glickman, and said, hey, I'd really like to just farm for the market. I'm pretty good at, making sure maybe corn is going to be more profitable that next year, or maybe wheat's going to be more profitable. So that Freedom to Farm really did open up and allow producers to make their own decision.
The Freedom to Farm bill that came out, I believe, in 1996 was very much a game changer in giving the farmer more control of what they grew, whereas for nearly 60 years prior to that, going back to the Dust Bowl days, you often destroyed crops you grew because of supply. There was an intention to control supply to help keep prices, at reasonable levels and not induce an oversupply. And so farmers were in a tough spot. They didn't have a lot of say, or at least total say in what they grew, and then they often had to tear up crops just to meet requirements for those programs. When Freedom to Farm came out, it pretty much did away with all that, and then it put farmers back in control a bit more of deciding what they grew, where, and when.
In 1999, the drop in many commodity prices, combined with disastrous weather in many parts of the country, caused increased demand of USDA farm programs. The year 2000 brought the Agriculture Risk Protection Act, an amendment to the Federal Crop Insurance Act that strengthened the safety net for agricultural producers.
It was one of the very first bills, Senator Roberts, when he was elected to the Senate, one of the first bills that he was really the champion and the primary author of, working with Bob Kerrey, which was a Democrat senator at the time from Nebraska. They created the modern framework for what we consider crop insurance today. It is a public-private partnership, so producers do put skin in the game and actually are buying up their level of coverage. But should we ever have to go back to a 2011 or 2012 type drought, certainly some of the producers in the northern high plains and further out west, they're experiencing drought-like conditions here in 2021. But if you have a major systemic nationwide drought, then the federal government does end up being the backstop and can help farmers make sure that they have enough funds to be able to farm the other year.
USDA's Risk Management Agency and crop insurance program has also been another game changer for providing a safety net for farmers and helping to curb the downside risk of farming, especially in areas of Kansas that are drought susceptible or otherwise. you are very vulnerable to 1 year, multi-year cycles, and having that safety net of crop insurance available if you opt into the program very much takes away some of that downside risk of farming.
That has provided a safety net that folks can utilize, and perhaps they're not quite as tied to having to plant certain crops. If they can have a crop insurance policy that fits their needs for risk management.
I think some of the most important things in our operation, a workable crop insurance program where it allows us to be more diversified and plant some crops. And if you don't have a good crop insurance program, you're going to be growing more wheat that's more consistent. You're going to be growing more sorghum, which maybe won't be the most beneficial to, like, let's say, the Kansas economy in terms of value that we can produce on those acres over a 5 or 10 year span.
And I remember there's a great member of Kansas Farm Bureau from Southwest Kansas. He once testified basically saying, without crop insurance, I wouldn't be lining up the equipment line to plant the next year. I'd have to line up that equipment line for the auction. Because certainly in places of western Kansas, it truly is high-risk agriculture. When you start getting into kind of the Hamilton and Stanton and even Wallace County, where they only average 14 to 16 inches of annual precipitation yearly, that's pretty hard to make a wheat crop grow. So many of our members here in Kansas, they are the wheat fallow, the grain sorghum fallow type rotations, where they give that land a break for 1 year so that they can then have something to harvest the year after. Many of those farm bill programs and certainly crop insurance are just fundamental bedrocks and cornerstone farm policy programs that our members do rely on.
2008, the Food, Conservation, and Energy Act expanded farm subsidies. 2014 saw the Farm Bill pass through Congress and signed into law 2 years late. As authority under its predecessor, the Food, Conservation, and Energy Act of 2008 had expired in 2012. In 2018, the Farm Bill was passed by Congress and signed into law. It primarily reauthorized many programs in the 2014 Farm Bill. 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic begins.
When the pandemic started to mushroom in March of 2020, and when states, including Kansas, it was determined that we needed to kind of shut down our business, our activity, our social networking and contact with people. One of the early decisions made was that agriculture was critical infrastructure. It was important to keep producers producing, processors processing, and the distribution of agricultural commodities, which was primarily food, and then of course in some cases would be fuel as well. So that was a early distinction that provided some relief or assurances in rural America, but in rural Kansas, but even in our urban areas, that hey, the food machine is going to continue as long as people are healthy, the workers are healthy. So that was, I think, a pretty important factor that happened early in that pandemic.
Some of the COVID relief programs that came out early on, they were kind of late in 2020. There were some that were livestock related because of the interruptions that COVID created in processing plants. There was a real impact at the farm gate level for swine producers and for feedlots, even for dairies. It was the craziest of things. You could, on the same day, you could see milk being dumped at a milk plant and the shelf of a grocery store being empty because they couldn't get the milk processed and delivered to that grocery store. And that's just, those are the sorts of things that are, they're unconscionable. But that's what COVID created, because we weren't ready for it. We hadn't planned for that sort of a pandemic, and we now are building, I think, insulation into the system to prevent that. But so those early programs were more livestock related. The later programs helped on the grain side. I think those had a real positive impact for growers. Created some stability back in the marketplace, but it also gave them, kind of some financial footing that they needed at a time in their planning cycle to allow them to make decisions that then impacted their 2021 planning intentions.
There was some modifications, and they're mostly guidelines. You know, when you think about marketing, to market some commodities, sometimes it's done in a somewhat social setting. You know, those continued with pretty strong guidance to take precautions about how many and social distancing. So I think it's fit well. We didn't have, farmers and ranchers and producers didn't stop in the pandemic. That may have been difficult at times to have access to the services that they needed or to the inputs, and we still have that today. Supply chain disruption with inputs, parts, and other factors. But business continues. The seed was planted, the cattle were turned out, and the calves were born. And we continue to that even through this pandemic.
Government policy has always been a driving factor in the prices, markets, and sustainability of resources in agriculture in the United States. And even though the results of these policies don't always turn out the way our leaders would hope them to be, the producer's bottom line is often a factor in making these policies. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Real Ag on government policy. As always, you can check out this and other episodes of Real Ag on SmokyHillsPBS.org. From the producers at Smoky Hills PBS, this has been Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.